Welcome back. We are bringing to you this special show from Islamabad and Kabul. You're watching Sarhad Ke Us Par. The relevant question that Samina asked was that we are hoping that in 2014, the same women that we saw being given a chance earlier on will be given another chance in 2014. The concern remains that there is a backdoor diplomacy happening, negotiations happening with the Taliban. Now, do women, and I'd like to put that question to our panelists there, do women have a share in the peace process, in the negotiations with the Taliban, so as to make sure that their rights are not usurped?
That's a very good question. What about the peace process? Aside from being in the government, what do you think is happening? Women don't have a voice in this peace process.
Thank you, Mr. Sultanzo. Greetings to the panel in Pakistan. In terms of the blame game that we always get stuck in, I think the people in Pakistan and the people in Afghanistan, and especially women on both sides of the border, we need to realize one reality and face it, and that is globalization and exchange.
Right.
It's going to happen, it's going to affect us. What goes wrong in Afghanistan will affect the people of Pakistan and vice versa. And I have lived in Pakistan for 19 years. I've studied there, so I have had interaction with the civil society sector in Pakistan. Unfortunately, the women movement in both countries is very urban. Now, when we come to the question of the peace process, I think if the periphery in Afghanistan as well as in Pakistan, and the point that Muniza raised in terms of Malala being shot, I think we unfortunately have a wrong assumption. We assume that women's issues and women's rights is a matter important to the people of Pakistan and Afghanistan, and it's first on their agenda. But unfortunately, that's not the thing. Because when we talk about the peace process, the question of would women's rights be a victim of this process or not comes again and again. And the fact that our people do not resist this, it is an indication that for the periphery, this is not a priority. In addition, we see when it comes to making laws, when it comes to moving legislation ahead, obviously there is pressure and there's also support from the international community. However, when there is a woman raped, for instance in Pakistan or in Afghanistan, I worked with Pakistani civil society organizations and we could not gather more than 100 people for a demonstration on the streets. The same is in Afghanistan, which is why we need to look at it together and with a more united and in-depth perspective. And an important element of that would be our capacity to listen to the periphery of our population in both the countries. And the periphery, unfortunately, has other priorities. So the direction that our struggle should take should not be based on the assumption that it is a matter important to us, but on the assumption that we need to ripen the issue of women's rights in Pakistan as well as in Afghanistan.
Thank you very much.
The concern that Arya over there had were real. How do you respond to that?
In both Pakistan and Afghanistan, countries where you have a large segment of the population that is incredibly poor, the priorities tend to be survival, physical survival. Now, do women's rights matter? And should this be a priority? I think that's problematic because you need to be looking at women's rights in the context of human rights. If you look at them very separately from the larger issue of the rights of citizens, you have a problem on your hands. It is up to, in both countries, parliamentarians, we have one here, we have one across the border in the panel, to understand that they need, in some ways, to take that lead. It's not just in terms of legislation, it's also in terms of playing a role in education, in outreach, and going beyond, as the panelists in Kabul said, the urban centers to their constituencies. Legislation does matter. I completely agree. Without legislation, you're not going to bring about any change.
So they need to take the lead, and you really haven't seen that from that side because they have 25% of their parliament is actually women. They have 65 women, Asma ji, in parliament over there. But unlike us, we faced a lot of resistance under Musharraf and even by extremist forces, even in our parliament. But they have faced resistance to such an extent that pro-women legislation has not gone through in their parliament. In fact, anti-women legislation has gone through. And Fawzia, I'd like to ask you here,
sorry, I'm cutting you. So this is what I'm saying is that Kabul has a different environment, and the rest of the Afghanistan, I mean, the more you go to the south and the north, they have a different environment. And I think that is one of the reasons that their legislations have been stopped. As contrary, when you come back to Pakistani parliament, it's a different situation where I think even an Islamist party does not stop the legislation for female empowerment.
They certainly try to. We've had Maulana Fazlur Rahman block legislation.
No, to some extent. I don't think
but
so.
They're unsuccessful, is your
they
point.
were unsuccessful,
okay,
but then
enough.
they did not go to such an extent. Then coming back to Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, where Maulana Fazlur Rahman has a say, but still today we see a different province as elections are coming up. We see with the strong laws that the Election Commission has passed, I do not see a constituency where anybody would dare today that not let a female vote, and I see this as a positive change for Pakistan.
So you don't see
this is like a make and break situation for a
anybody
Pakistani
affording to ignore women of Pakistan. I'll throw that question now to the panelists right there in Afghanistan, and I would like to add to that also. We don't know whether President Karzai is pro-women or whether he is anti-women, because he has supported to some extent anti-women legislation. For example, he did support the Shia personal status law that we saw, in which Shia men were given the right to, in a way, reprimand their wives if they didn't satisfy them. So how do you see that? We see it with a lot of concern from here, and certainly there has been legislation passed in Pakistan. The extremist factions have been unable to block it. They have tried, but they have been unable to do so.
I would like to address your question about Mr. Karzai. He knows that I have opinions about him. I don't think he's pro-women or anti-women. Whichever is convenient, I think, is his stance. Please go ahead.
At the Independent Directorate of Local Governance, we recently, on the occasion of International Women's Day, launched an anti-harassment policy guideline, the purpose of which is improving the working conditions for women at IDLG. It's a government initiative, but it was supported by the parliament members, it was supported by the senators, it was supported by civil society organizations, it was supported by the international community. So I think we shouldn't pick a couple of bad examples and then consider them the entire pattern. There are also patterns for cooperation between these different institutions and the different women-led institutions that can be fruitful. And I would also like to connect this to the experience in Pakistan and very briefly link it to the issue of how legislation has been effective in Pakistan and how not here. I was part of the civil society movement for some time in Pakistan as I worked there, and when I was a student. In Pakistan, it took the civil society sector more than a decade to come up with an anti-harassment bill, which was finally passed under the current, recently removed government of Pakistan. We learned from that experience. We considered the lessons learned from that experience, and when we tried the anti-harassment policy guideline at IDLG, we considered that, and we moved on.
We have to take a short break right now, but after the break, we will ask the question whether progressive forces in both countries give way to regressive forces, and will women's rights be the first things to go on the negotiating table with the Taliban? All of that after this short break.